Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today I've got answering student questions. Actually, just one question this time. This is an excerpt of what became a 5.5-hour video that I made for my students this summer. Right? They asked in a discussion forum a series of 25 questions, 25 students, 25 questions, and I decided I would do a video response to them. In my class, when I'm doing face-to-face, they ask anonymous questions, and I have to stand in front of the class and give somewhere between a 2 and a 5-minute response. Now, I'm not limited to the 5 minutes since I was on video, and obviously I wasn't limited because I went for hours and hours and hours. Some students got an entire lecture in response. So I've taken a couple of those questions, and I've made small videos out of those. And then eventually I'll publish the entire video. But I just want to remind you, as you listen to my responses, these are mostly on the fly. I mean, I didn't do a lot of preparation to answer these questions. I simply looked at it and said, here's how I would respond to that. Here's some thoughts of mine. And those thoughts also are in the context of this is a class that has a broad spectrum of students in it from a wide variety of different backgrounds and different opinions about mostly the topic of evolutionary biology. And so my responses have that in mind. Some of my responses are a little different than maybe the tact I would take if I were sitting down with you over a cup of coffee and talking about these subjects, or if I was talking to a specific critic or something like that. So just bear that in mind in terms of the style of response that I'm going to provide for some of these questions. I'm also in a sort of a teaching mode because I'm trying to use my responses to help them understand some principles. So I'm breaking down some of their questions into fundamental assumptions and trying to derive sort of like things that I know that they're going to need to know, through the rest of the class, and trying to sort of squeeze those elements into my answers to their questions. Okay, so with that caveat, or those caveats, let's proceed to answering a student question. Coming on up. Religion tends to be a heavy influence on what people study regarding evolution. Or maybe I might rephrase that. I think what they mean is it has a strong influence on what people believe about evolution. Right? There's no doubt about that. All right. Some religions, some strains of religion would have very strong feelings about evolutionary biology and evolution in general. I have friends who went or are currently going to schools that are taught very different information regarding evolution. There tends to be quite a bit of controversy on certain theories and ideas between science and religion. Many people struggle to figure out whether to believe what their religion taught them or science studies. It can be very confusing as to which one to believe because both have their own evidence proving as to why their theories and ideas are correct. How do people choose which theories and ideas to believe? Does one or the other have more evidence behind their theories and ideas proving theirs to be right and not the other? Is there a common ground on these theories and ideas that are formed by science versus those formed by religions so that people don't have to make that difficult choice which one to believe? Now, that's a lot of questions in a question. That's a whole lot of questions. Let me just start by saying this question reveals one of the big problems we're dealing with in society right now. And that is this idea that everybody has their own facts, right? And so one side presents theirs and they have all their good evidence for this, and somebody else tells me and I listen to them and it's like, no, you're presenting really great evidence. Your idea sounds good. So how am I supposed to choose between the two? Because they both sound pretty good. If you go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky and you read all that information, you don't know much about evolutionary theory at all. You're going to be told a lot of things about evolutionary theory, right? You're going to be, evolutionists believe this, they believe this, they believe this, they say this, they say this, and here's a bunch of quotes, right, from evolutionary biologists. But here's all this other evidence that suggests the Earth is young and that organisms aren't related to one another by common ancestry. If you don't have any other knowledge, you could find it very persuasive, right? And then you might come to my class. You might be in this class. And then you read this textbook and you read about the mechanisms and how they function. And you read examples about how organisms have adapted to their environment and so forth. And you're like, but that's really compelling too. And you read that whole thing about whales, and which is much more than you'll hear from, say, creationists who usually present just a couple little snapshots or pieces of information about whales. And explain them away, but now you've seen like to much greater depth, like the amount of evidence and the types of experiments that have been done. And so you get a whole different perspective there. And it's kind of like, okay, I've got this idea and I got this idea, and it feels like I've got two choices. How do I know which one's better? And this is what happens with lots of different things in society today, right? Where we're sort of thrown very, very strongly worded and phrased, like you have to believe this because of this. And you're thrown a whole bunch of evidence in one perspective versus another perspective. And it makes it seem like we have competing equal theories. And I just have to choose which pieces of evidence I want to use and which idea I want to go for. How do people choose which theories and ideas to believe? So that decision on which theories and ideas to believe, it's obviously really complex, and it's a deeply personal one, right? It involves a bunch of factors. You've got your individual beliefs, you have your personal experiences, you've got your cultural influences around you, your family and friends, you've got the weight you're going to assign to the scientific evidence versus religious teachings, right? So everyone kind of has a different mixture of those, right? You have different perspectives, and you're going to prioritize different sources of information and knowledge to form your beliefs, right? All that's just to say, hey, it's a complex world, right? And each one of you is subject to different factors. And so there's no simple solution to this, except there kind of is a simple solution to the scientific side of things, right? When it comes to scientific theories, and evolution is a scientific theory. All right. Well, I'm trying to evolution versus evolutionism, applying some findings of evolution and then trying to take that and apply it to sociology and to all kinds of other stuff, right? Such as evolution. And evolution, as we've been talking about here and in this class, is a scientific discipline. All right. It's a scientific theory. Right. And so what is that based on? What are scientific theories based on? Well, they're based on empirical evidence. All right. They're based on experimentation. They're based on the consensus of the scientific community that's built over doing many different experiments. Right. So scientific theories are being continually tested. Right. They're being refined. They're being expanded. You got new evidence emerges. Right. So the strength of a scientific theory lies in the ability to explain natural phenomena. Right? And those explanations do what? They make hopefully accurate predictions. And they're going to be subject to future, scrutiny and empirical scrutiny. So when you ask like, well, how can I know? Well, how do you know that, organisms are made of cells, right? You have evidence that you can point to. So if it's a question about the physical makeup of the world and how the physical matter, the natural laws of this universe function, the scientific method is a really powerful method of knowing and making decisions about what is the best theory, right? Because you have a way of testing it. On the other hand, you've got religious beliefs. That's going to be based partly on what I guess you could nebulously call faith. You have revelation, which would be some kind of direct word from somebody. So you have revelation, which is maybe words from the past, all right, written down that represent edicts from God or from a higher being, right? Those are words that come to you as truth. It's kind of like, and you also have, your parents telling you stuff, right? And you trust them, all right? You can trust your religious leaders. You can trust your parents. You can trust your grandparents. They can give you advice, right? So they provide a framework for understanding, the meaning and purpose of life, moral values, relationship between humans and divine. So they carry, they vary, of course, among traditions and individuals. Now, I happen to be a religious person. And so I happen to believe in a particular form of revelation that I think is very important and weighs very heavily on some of my decisions and some of my beliefs, right? And some of who I am and and my own understanding of the meaning and purpose of life. But I can also look at scientific theories and I can say, I might not like that scientific theory because maybe it conflicts with something that I think is the way, what I think has been revealed as the way the world has been made or should operates, right? Some truth about the world that this scientific theory seems to be incompatible with. I can, and here's what I would say in class, is I can say I can look at that scientific theory and I can say I don't like that scientific. I don't like the conclusion of that scientific theory because it makes me feel tense, right? It makes me feel like I have some conflict here. And I don't like conflict. I'm not a conflict person. I just want everyone to get along, right? And so I don't like that feeling. But that doesn't mean that I'm just going to sweep away the scientific theory, because if I can look at it and I can say I can actually look at that evidence. It's one thing to say like, oh, your professor told you this and that's a theory and you just have to believe that. And there is a belief sort of aspect to that if you're unwilling to look at the evidence yourself. If you're unwilling to go and actually read the papers and like test those ideas for yourself, look at the evidence and say, does what they're saying make sense? Is this theory been developed in a way that really truly does follow the scientific method and comes to logical, proper conclusions? If you're willing to do that, and I look at it and say like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That does seem to be the best possible explanation for the evidence we have today. This is the best theory. I cannot think of a more economical, logical, and consistent way of explaining all of the observations I have in front of me. I can't think of a better theory, right? Now, I might still say, I don't think that theory is right because I weigh this other thing higher in my mind, all right? So for me, that's, personally, my beliefs and so forth, all right? I weigh this higher. But I also will not do this. I will not say to you, yeah, that theory is bunk, all right? I don't like that particular theory, but I can present it as this is the best scientific explanation for this set of evidence, right? I can't deny that. And so that's partly what we're doing, and that's partly what you're doing is you're learning a whole large body of science, not just evolutionary biology. You're going to learn a lot of other stuff that comes into conflict with a lot of other ideas outside of science. And hopefully what you're going to learn, and hopefully what you're going to be taught in my class and other classes, is examining the evidence before us. What is the best explanation? What's the best evidence, natural explanation we can come up with to explain what we're observing? And so here it is. And if you choose to believe otherwise, you at least have to acknowledge that I don't have any evidence for what I believe, right? I can't necessarily logic you into my belief. I can't present to you, well, here's a whole nother body of science, of observations from the world that are better explained by my belief. Because if you're going to explain it with your belief and your belief is the scientific explanation, well then you got a better theory. But those other forms of beliefs and other forms of ideas and other things that we accept that are outside of science, you're not going to be able to explain with a better scientific theory, right? Because if you can explain it with a better scientific theory, then you're explaining it in a naturalistic way. By definition, you're explaining it through naturalistic methods and means. All right, so once again, got to remind you, science and religion often have different aims, right? They have different methodologies. And so it's just always important to keep that in the back of your mind. There's a different aim, there's a different goal. Sometimes you're asking what sounds like the same question, but you're asking slightly different questions, and that's why the conflict exists too. All right, science is trying to explain the natural world through observations and testing. And religion is addressing, in many cases, ultimate meaning. So if religion is explaining ultimate meaning, purpose, and values, then you can offer sort of this complementary approach, right? Perspective, where different aspects of human existence are being explained in different ways. So finding common ground between science and religion, I mean, this is just a topic that's ongoing exploration and dialogue. You got to open yourself up to dialogue. You have to be willing to look at evidence. You have to be willing to, and I know it's kind of scary. You want to just have the answer, right? I mean, we live in a society where it's like, I just want black and white. I want to know, like, truth, this is a lie, this is true. But I think you got to be ready to hold yourself, like I said before, you got to be able to hold a little bit of tension there. You got to be able to say, these might be different perspectives on the same thing. Maybe that's why it's in tension. Maybe I need to examine both of them. I need to examine the science and understand it better. I need to understand my own, like, how I came to these convictions. What are my hermeneutical methods for interpreting scripture? What religious leaders do I trust? What is their background and how did they come to their conclusions? I mean, this could take years of study to really be able to examine their thoughts. Because if you haven't really delved into that on the religious side either, you can be easily swayed by some charlatan or somebody who may be well-meaning, but is saying you have to believe something that actually isn't true either. Just like in science, there are a million quacks out there, right? That are saying, that they're telling you this is what science says, or you have to believe this because I got this evidence for this or whatever. And they're a bunch of conspiracy theories, right? So you can be taken advantage of in the world of science, and you can be taken advantage of in the world of religion. And so that's another reason why you shouldn't just immediately think, okay, I know this here, and so I need to reject this over here. Be willing to weigh the evidence on both sides and be willing to hold that tension for a long time before you feel like you have to make a decision.